The iron stove inside the cabin groaned as the timber settled, throwing long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. Joe Miller ran a brass patch down the barrel of his Remington 30-06, the smell of gun oil thick in the chilly autumn air. Outside, the dense hemlocks of the Upper Peninsula pressed close against the clearing, their boughs locking together like fingers to blot out the dying daylight. He was 3 days into his solitary elk hunt, 50 miles past the last paved logging road, deep in a valley where the locals spoke only in muted tones. The rumors had circulated in the bait shops along the highway for decades, hunters vanishing from locked tree stands, abandoned trucks found upright in deep ravines, and footprints the size of snowshoes pressed into the frozen mud. Most folks blamed the terrain, cougars, or sudden hypothermia, but Joe knew how to read the woods. He had spent 20 years tracking big game across North America, and he knew that nature was rarely cruel without intent. Something in these mountains didn't just hunt for survival. It guarded its territory with a deliberate, calculating malice. The first anomaly had occurred at dawn along the ridgeline. Joe had found a white-tailed buck suspended 12 feet off the ground, wedged violently into the fork of an old oak tree. Its neck was twisted at an impossible angle, but the carcass remained completely unblemished by scavengers. No coyotes, no crows, no flies. It was a display, a marker left by something possessive and vastly powerful. As the last crimson streak faded from the horizon, the forest went completely mute. The usual evening symphony of crickets, tree frogs, and roosting birds died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence that made the skin on Joe's neck prickle. He set the cleaning rod aside and quietly slid a 5-round magazine into the rifle's receiver. A heavy, unhurried thud echoed from the tree line 200 yards out, a sound like a massive boulder being dropped onto raw earth. Seconds later, a metallic screech shattered the quiet. Joe moved to the heavy timber window frame, unlatched the shutter just enough to peer into the gloom. Down in the ravine, where he had parked his customized 4-wheel drive truck, the dark silhouette of the vehicle was rocking rhythmically. A tall cable wrapped around the front winch snapped with a violent, whipping crack as the unseen force pulled the 3-ton machine completely off its axles. The creature wasn't just aggressive, it was dismantling his means of escape. Joe felt a cold bead of sweat trace down his temple as he watched the shadow move with astounding, fluid grace despite its titanic proportions. It stood well over 8 feet tall, broad as a barn door, its coarse fur blending seamlessly into the night. Instead of roaring, it produced a deep, low-frequency hum that vibrated directly through the cabin floorboards and into Joe's boots. Then came the wood knocks, 3 sharp, rhythmic strikes against hardwood echoing from the east, answered immediately by 2 heavy strikes from the west. It was flanking him, using the terrain to box him into the cabin. The creature down by the truck turned slowly toward the cabin, its eyes catching the faint embers of the stove fire through the shutter seam, reflecting a dull, oily yellow. It raised a thick, heavy arm and pointed directly at the window before slipping silently back into the wall of trees. The room grew instantly colder as Joe latched the wooden shutter and drove the iron deadbolt deep into its keeper. He backed away from the window, keeping his body low and his weapon held firmly against his shoulder. The infrasound hum still resonated through the cabin walls, rattling the tin coffee mugs on the shelf and setting off a nauseant tremor in the pit of his stomach. This was no mindless brute reacting out of territorial instinct. This was an apex predator conducting a siege. The creature began its psychological assault from the perimeter. A volley of heavy river stones struck the cedar shingle roof with thunderous cracks, each impact sounding like a rifle shot indoors. Joe stood dead center in the room, rotating slowly with his rifle trained on the perimeter walls, listening to the heavy footsteps moving effortlessly through the brush outside. The beast was deliberately testing the structural integrity of the cabin, searching for weaknesses, while driving its prey toward panic. Suddenly, a long, mournful vocalization rose from the tree line, a sound that shifted from a low, guttural growl into a terrifyingly human-like howl. The sheer volume shook dust from the ceiling rafters, causing the hanging cast iron skillet to swing back and forth like a pendulum. Joe tightened his grip on the stock, forcing his breathing to remain slow and controlled. He had seen desperate animals before, but the calculating rhythm of these actions chilled him far more than the cold night air. From the north side of the cabin came a sickening scrape of long, thick nails dragging along the rough-hewn pine logs. The creature was pacing, circling the perimeter with a fluid, silent tread that defied its massive size. Joe watched the thick timber wall buckle slightly inward under immense weight, then spring back as the pressure shifted. It was probing the corners, feeling for the weak points in the mortise and tenon joints. Then came the mimicry, a tactic designed to shatter the last lingering shreds of a hunter's resolve. From the shadows, near the porch, came a voice, raspy, unnatural and halting, uttering syllables that sounded remarkably like human speech, cobbled together from snippets heard past campfires. Joe, the sound rasped through the gaps in the timber logs, unnatural and heavy with wet breath. Come out. Joe felt the hair on his arms stand straight up, but he held his ground in the absolute darkness. He refused to give away his position by speaking or panicking, knowing that sight in this dim interior was his enemy's only blind spot. The creature smashed its massive shoulder against the heavy oak front door, sending a shower of wood splinters spraying across the room. The iron hinges groaned under the impact, twisting slightly in their mountings as the entire structure shuddered. Joe raised the Remington, lined up the iron sights with the center of the flexing door, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed room, the muzzle flash illuminating the interior with a harsh, violent light. Outside, a sharp, wet grunt of pain echoed through the night, followed immediately by heavy, frantic crashing through the underbrush as the beast retreated into the dark. Joe racked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass casing, knowing he had only bought himself a brief reprieve. The smell of acrid cordite filled the cabin, mingling with the copper stench of fresh blood that seeped through the cracks in the doorframe. Joe moved instantly, racking another 30-06 round into the chamber, while keeping his eyes locked onto the splintered entrance. He knew the gunshot hadn't killed the beast. The thick bone structure and dense muscle mass of a creature that size could easily absorb a non-vital hit. What the shot had done was strip away its illusion of invulnerability, making it far more dangerous and unpredictable. Outside, The forest fell back into that thick and natural stillness, but Joe didn't let down his guard for a single second. He stuffed extra cartridges into his coat pockets, strapped his heavy hunting knife to his hip, and slung a durable canvas pack over his shoulders. Remaining inside the cabin was no longer a viable strategy. The front door was structural compromise, and once the creature realized he was trapped in a wooden box, it would simply tear the roof down. His only chance of survival lay in reaching the abandoned logging railway 4 miles down the valley, where an old maintenance hanged car remained parked on the rusty iron rails. Taking a deep breath, Joe unlatched the back window shutter, slung his rifle, and lowered himself quietly into the frosty high grass behind the cabin. The night air was freezing, each breath forming a pale plume of steam that drifted away on the light mountain breeze. He kept low, using the heavy shadows of the stacked firewood and the thick hemlock bushes to conceal his movement as he skirted the clearing. Behind him, a massive weight slammed onto the roof of the cabin with a sickening crunch, shattering the main ceiling beam. The distraction gave Joe the head start he needed to dive into the dense timberline. Moving through the dark woods was a harrowing test of memory and instinct, as using a flashlight would turn him into an illuminated target. He navigated by the pale moonlight filtering through the high canopy, slipping between the towering trunks like a ghost. Yet, despite his careful footwork, he could hear the relentless phantom presence parallel to his path, a heavy, deliberate shadow gliding through the brush without snapping a single twig. The beast was driving him, using subtle movements and low guttural huffs to herd him down toward the steep rock faces of Blackwood Ravine. It was an ancient hunting technique, squeezing the prey into a natural dead end where escape became impossible. Joe recognized the trap just as the ground began to slope violently downward toward the cliff edge overlooking a roaring mountain creek 70 feet below. He skidded to a halt on the wet pine needles, his boots kicking loose shale over the precipice. A massive silhouette detached itself from the gloom 30 yards ahead, blocking the narrow ridge path that led back down toward the railway. The creature stood fully erect now, its amber eyes burning through the darkness as its chest heaved with deep, raspy breaths. Blood matted the dark fur along its left shoulder, where Joe's bullet had grazed it, but the injury seemed only to fuel its silent, lethal focus. It raised both arms, widening its posture to block the moonlight, and took a slow, heavy step forward. Trapped against the sheer cliff face, Joe backed up until his heels hovered over the crumbling ledge of the ravine. The creature advanced with methodical confidence, its heavy silhouette cutting off any route along the upper trail. It lowered its head, letting out that low, organ-rattling hum that made the loose gravel around Joe's boots vibrate in rhythm with his pounding heart. Joe unslung the Remington, but he knew at this point-blank range, a single rifle shot wouldn't stop the sheer momentum of an 800-pound beast charging forward. He needed an equalizer, something that would leverage the terrain against the creature's immense weight and aggression. His hand reached into his canvas pack, searching past the emergency rations until his fingers locked around a cold, heavy metal cylinder, a 12-ounce can of pressurized bear pepper spray designed for charging grizzlies. Attached to the canister was a road flare he had taped to the side for emergency signaling during high-altitude winter hunts. It was an improvised incendiary trap, volatile and dangerous, but it was the only option left on the edge of the abyss. The creature lunged forward with explosive speed, its long muscular arms reaching out to crush Joe against the rock face. Joe struck the igniter cap on the flare with his thumb, igniting a roaring, blinding red flame that erupted into the darkness. As the beast instinctively recoiled from the sudden flare of light, Joe slammed the nozzle of the bear spray directly into the open flare flame. A roaring column of fire leapt 6 feet into the night, engulfing the creature's head and chest in an intense, screaming wall of heat and chemical irritant. The creature let out an agonizing, ear-splitting screech that echoed down the entire length of the valley. Blinded by the chemical burn and startled by the sudden wall of flame, the massive beast stumbled backward, its heavy weight tearing up the fragile ledge beneath its feet. The rock shelf gave way with a thunderous crack, sending the titan tumbling down the steep, jagged face of Blackwood Ravine into the rushing, icy waters below. The heavy splash resonated up the canyon walls, followed by the sound of churning water and heavy rocks shifting in the current. Joe didn't wait to see if the beast would climb back out of the gorge. Turning instantly, he sprinted down the clearing path, his heart hammering against his ribs as he covered the remaining half-mile to the valley floor. He hit the rusty iron rails of the old logging track, spotting the small, manual pump-action handcar sitting abandoned in the brush near an old timber siding. He threw his rifle onto the wooden deck, grabbed the iron pump handle, and began driving the gears down with every ounce of strength remaining in his limbs. As the handcar accelerated down the sloping track toward the distant highway junction, Joe looked back over his shoulder toward the dark canopy of the forest. High up on the ridgeline, framed against the cold pale moon, a massive silhouette stood motionless, watching the train track with quiet, calculating intensity. It was battered, but it was still standing, an immortal guardian of the high woods that would wait patiently for the next hunter to cross its border. Joe pushed the handle down with renewed force, leaving the dark woods and their ancient apex predator behind in the shadows.